All right, guys, welcome back to our teaching in the book of Ruth. Now, the last time we left off, we had completed chapter 1, where Naomi has arrived back home. Remember, we want to keep in mind the picturesque scene that the Lord is giving us here. She comes back home in a poor and impoverished condition. But nevertheless, before she does arrive back home, remember, she was heavily trying to influence her daughter-in-laws to return back home to their own people. Remember, she was that is Naomi, was in the land of Moab, and therefore her daughter-in-laws were Moabites. And so Orpah, one of her daughter-in-laws, returned back home to her own people. And so Naomi was left trying to influence her last daughter-in-law, Ruth, to go on back and follow the example of your sister-in-law who has returned back to her people and her gods. That's always so important to remember here. The gods of the Moabites, over against or even versus the God of the Israelites, the only true God, Yahweh of the Israelites, from whom will such blessings that we're going to read about in the remainder of this book flow. But anyway, so what happened? Ruth adamantly vows to remain with Naomi and never leave her side, and gave us some of the most beautiful writings of friendship, allegiance, and commitment that we have in all of Scripture from one human being to another. And she vows to go with her wherever she goes, live with her wherever she lives, and even her God, Naomi's God, Yahweh, will be her God, and therefore the place where Naomi is finally buried, Ruth will also be buried. And she vowed that nothing would separate her from Naomi. And we always want to remember now, when we do consider these things, Ruth is a young woman, Naomi is an old woman. We want to remember the levirate marriage, that is, the hope of Ruth would be to marry a son of Naomi, but Naomi is old and therefore will have no more sons, thus yielding for the moment, in the mindset of Ruth, no possibility of a husband. And since there is no husband, there will be no children either. So all she is having is a commitment to a poor old woman. But nevertheless, she vows to go back with Naomi to her own land in Bethlehem of Judah. So Naomi finally arrives back home, and quickly the women of the city can see there is a visible difference in Naomi in how she comes back home than how she once left. And Naomi even declares to her in somewhat of a poetic sense, "Call me no longer Naomi," which means pleasant, but call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Lord, she attributed to God her circumstances. God has dealt, El Shaddai, Almighty God, has dealt bitterly with me. And at the same time, if you recall what we were saying, in the shadows is Ruth standing there. But at the time, Naomi is not giving any consideration to Ruth, who will be one of her greatest blessings. You can even say one of her greatest assets in the very near future. But nevertheless, so Naomi is greeted, and the women of the city can see the impoverished nature of her appearance, and thus the two women enter back home into Bethlehem. But remember now, devoid of their former assets, that is, the things that were previously owned by Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So they return in an impoverished condition, but it was during the season of the barley harvest. And this is where we take off in our next section in the book of Ruth. So keep in mind, the background scenario is the barley harvest. Now, Ruth chapter 2, looking at verses 1 through 17. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And so notice we immediately, as we are transitioning into the next section of this narrative in the book of Ruth, that it centers on Boaz. So we're going to basically have, for the most part, two primary characters, which will be Boaz and Ruth. However, Boaz will kind of have the preeminence in this particular section right now, because we are going to show the scripture the interest that Boaz takes in Ruth and the interactions between the two of them. So it starts off with the introduction of Boaz, because he is the most preeminent character at this particular time. And he was related to Naomi, and the scripture lets us know that he was in of relationship to Naomi's husband, her dead husband, who was named Elimelech. And this sets us up for the concept or the aspect of what will be the kinsman redeemer. Now, I'm not going to talk much about that at this particular time, but I'll just simply say he is related to her dead husband, so he will be able to reacquire the assets of Naomi's husband's family, that is Elimelech as well as his sons. He'll be able to reacquire those assets because, according to the law of Moses, a near family member can reacquire the assets of another dead family member, especially if that member died without leaving any type of sons. And that will be the son of Naomi, Elimelech's son, who will be Ruth's husband. Okay, so therefore it sets us up for the whole situation of a man who is able to reacquire the assets of Elimelech, and also too, inadvertently, but it would be the will of Boaz to acquire the wife, that is Ruth the Moabitess. But anyway, going back to verse number 1, so it brings him to the forefront during the barley harvest season, and it shows that he is a man of great wealth, and also his name was Boaz. And I like that too, because as we've been talking about the names of the particular characters that are involved, whether Naomi, Ruth, we also introduced to Boaz, and his names mean in him is strength, or in his strength. But the title goes well, the name of Boaz goes well with the type of person that we will see him to be, a man of righteous integrity. That's the best way that I can put it. You will see as we work through the text his righteousness in his dealing with Ruth and other things. We'll talk about that. In his dealing with Ruth, even with his greetings to his workers. All of that in the future of this text. We'll see that righteousness, and we'll also see that integrity, which implies the strength of Boaz. And also you can see the implicity of strength with respect to his wealth, because he is called a mighty man of wealth. Chayil, I believe, is the actual Hebrew word that is used here. But anyway, so we have Boaz, verse number 2, and Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Now, I may not talk about each and every verse and stop, but there is much to see in consideration to verse number 2. So let's look at that. So now imagine in your mind, keep in mind that picturesque scenery that God has given us. These two impoverished women, one is old, unable to work, unable to provide for herself. One is young and able to provide. But remember now, upon the shoulders of Ruth is the responsibility to provide for both of them. Ruth has to provide not only for herself, but also for her old mother-in-law. So we see that impoverished women who have nothing. So we also see now Ruth asks her mother-in-law, and notice the thing, she makes a request to her mother-in-law to go to work. So what is God trying to get us to see? He is also continuing to develop or give us a picture of not just simply the attitude of Ruth, but her character. So we are also being allowed to see the integrity, because notice now, this young woman is going off to work. And the point that I'm stressing, what's in the back of my mind, is she asks permission from her old mother-in-law. And all the while at the same time, what I want you guys to be considering, especially ladies, because we can really understand the importance of these proverbial insights that God is trying to give us in the person, the characteristics, the personality of Ruth, these good things, these highlights in her personality, in the way that she is, the way that she is so respectable. So I want you ladies who are listening, even to me, to notice these things and to differentiate how that this is so, it runs countercultural to our world today, to what we call, women call now, independence and strength and all of that, what it is to be a woman of respectability, the nastiness, the difficult, and being, it's hard for people to deal with you, your attitude, you are not humble at all. But none of these traits are being found in Ruth. And so this is the point that God is trying to show us, even ladies, to show you about the character of Ruth. And what we see here is that deep respectableness that we see, how respectful she is towards, and remember, this is Ruth's mother-in-law, but nevertheless, she asks her permission to go to work. She is not like, well, look, I got to get off my butt and go make money and take care of both of us, and while you just sit down in the house. But glean, if you'll let me use that particular verb that is going to be employed in the context today, glean that of the personality of Ruth in her respectfulness for her mother-in-law. And let us, especially ladies, take note of that. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field. So her mother-in-law, of course, needing provisions. And Ruth, the only one able to work, of course, she told her, go. But now, before I get into verse number 3, I almost jumped in too soon. Notice what Ruth said. She wanted to go into the field and glean. Now, let me take some time to talk about that too, because as a poor, impoverished woman in ancient Israelite agricultural society at that time, so Ruth was not going out to be employed. So she was not going to work. But what was happening is, in the law, the commandments of the law was, if there's a man who owns a field, that when the man gleans when the man harvests from the field, or the man or his workers, same idea, that he should leave some behind for the poor of society. Now, the poor in society would be, as I told you in the previous videos, widows, foreigners, and children without parents, okay? So widows, foreigners, and children without parents. These would be the poor of society who God commanded the field owner to allow them, because the field owner was not to literally go into the field and harvest everything, but leave some things behind for the poor to come and glean. And this is what the word glean is all about. When you come and gather what the reapers have actually left. And this is what Ruth is requesting. And also too, and I'm not going to come in on this, but think about it. This was God's system of providing for the poor. God did not give the poor. He didn't just simply say, go and harvest it, turn around and give it to the poor. No, God allowed the mechanism of work to still be there for the poor. So the poor still had to work, but they worked in the sense of not for the employment, but they had to go and gather their own food by their own hand. The point that I'm stressing here simply is it was not simply given to them. Think about that, especially in our country today, how stuff is always just given to people in the absence of any kind of work. But anyway, going back to the context, what? So Ruth wants to go and be one of the gleaners in the field. She wants to go after, when I say go after, it means follow after the reapers have taken a good amount of the harvest, the wheat or whatever, from the crop, and the remainder that is purposely left over by the reapers, she would therefore follow after them and gather this amount. So this is what it means by to glean. But anyway, she continues to say, after one in whose favor, in whose sight I might find favor. So she was not talking about any particular field in her mind, but in whatever field that I should come upon, and they take note of me and allow me to be one of the gleaners, one who comes after the reapers. So the point that I'm pushing here is the providence of God. This is what is being happening here, because Ruth does not know whose field she's going to go and be a gleaner in that field. But also note in verse number 1, we've already introduced Boaz. It is the time of harvest, and Boaz is one of those rich farmers. He's a rich farmer, and Ruth will end up in his farm as one of the gleaners. But Boaz is also kin to Ruth, but she doesn't know this. So the point is, providence is already taking place here. God's hand is at work, even though Ruth does not realize God's hand is at work. As a matter of fact, at this point of the juncture, no one knows that God's hand is at work. And even while I'm here, we do recall, and I want you to recall, the dire circumstances of Ruth and Naomi, their impoverished condition, how things started out for Naomi. What did she say? I left out full, having a husband and 2 sons. I returned back empty. And God, Naomi said, caused this bitterness. God was the reason for this situation. And we can see again the providence of God in chapter 2, how God is changing her situation. Even it might be said how God himself caused a difficult situation to turn out to be a blessing for Ruth, and thus fulfilling what he says in Romans 8. And we know that God causes what? All things to work together for the good of those who love the Lord, to those who are the called according to his purposes. And we see clearly that even though Naomi doesn't realize it, Ruth does not realize it, both of them are the called ones unto a purpose of God, a greater purpose, a purpose beyond their present case of poverty. But anyway, let me go on, because I don't want to start preaching there. So she requests, that is, Ruth, to go out and glean in some field that someone might accept her, and she receives the permission from her mother-in-law. So verse 3, so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened, notice again that sense of providence. She so happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. And we remember that he is her kinsman, even though she doesn't know it. Boaz, who is of the family of Elimelech. So again, we see providence being stressed in verse number 3. Ruth has now gone out early in the morning to work, to provide food for herself and Naomi. And she so happens to, don't let me say stumble upon, but may I use that? The field of someone who is related to Naomi. Thus, he's related to Ruth. Now, verse number 4, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Okay, I like that too. Such simpleness, but yet such beauty in the meaning and what it says about Boaz. Now, coming from the city of Bethlehem, because we remember the fields that they would use for agriculture would be stationed outside of the city. And remember, the home city of both Boaz as well as Naomi, even Elimelech, her husband, is Bethlehem. So Boaz is coming from the city to the place where his workers are now working. So Boaz is coming, of course, as the owner of the field and all of his operations. He wants to check on things and see how things are doing. But what we can see by Boaz's greeting, and this is what I want you guys to look at. Look at the way that he greets those who works for him. Says a number of things about him. He says, may Yahweh, may the Lord be with you. So what is the Bible trying to say? It is trying to let us see the righteous character of Boaz in how he greets his workers in the name of the Lord. And even we can also see the integrity of Boaz, the humility and concern of Boaz. Remember, the Bible called him a mighty man of wealth. So he was very wealthy, but notice he was not snobbish. That's the point. He was godly and he was caring and concerning even for people who worked for him, the servants in the field. So we now can see the scripture is trying to show us the character of Boaz. Then, verse number 5, Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? The servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning even until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. So we are moved forward into the scene as Boaz now has come into the field, checking on how things are progressing for the day that he somehow takes notice of Ruth. Now, I do like this part too, because what? The Bible leaves it doesn't say what it was about Ruth that Boaz should take notice of her. Was it her looks or something? We don't know. But at the same time, it almost, no, definitely, as we've been looking at the contextual point of all of this, what? The providence of God. God is clearly in the scene. God is bringing all of these things to pass, and thus God may be very much behind his desire, his attention being upon Ruth the Moabite. Yes, it's absolutely God is involved in his taking notice of her. So however God is doing it, using the man's own natural desire or affinity of what he might think is beautiful or attractive in a woman, I don't know, but God is in the picture, okay? But he does, my point, Boaz takes notice of Ruth for whatever reason that he does, and he begins to inquire to the servant manager. In other words, there's a manager who is over all of the other servants of Boaz in the field, and also to what is implied in the text. So you're going to have what? Two things. You're going to have in the field working, the reapers are actually working in the gathering of the harvest. And so therefore they are under the management of this manager that Boaz is talking to. So he's familiar with those people working. They're under his direct supervision. But also, too, remember we spoke about the gleaners. The gleaners were the people, they did not work for the manager. They did not work in the field. They just simply came into the field, according to the law of Moses, to gather those things that were purposely left behind, those fragments, that small amount that the reapers, the owner of the field, Boaz and his reapers, were commanded to leave behind for the poor. Okay, so the manager would be familiar with the reapers. He employs them, he runs them, but also too, he has to give permission. And that's the point I'm trying to make. He has to give permission to those who would glean, come after the reapers, who would glean in Boaz's field. So therefore, Ruth had to get the permission of the manager to glean after the reapers. And this is what Ruth was saying, that in whose field I may find favor in his sight. So she understood she needed permission from whoever was running the field, all right, running these particular activities. So we find here that the manager of the field, Boaz, is now talking to him as Ruth has caught his attention, and he asks about Ruth and the manager, because Ruth had to get his permission to glean after the reapers. So he would inquire about Ruth, because remember, you want to make sure that whoever is reaping in the field, they meet the qualification. They were poor, and therefore they're not just out there trying to get some out the field for nothing, without working for it or without paying for it. But they are indeed poor and impoverished, and therefore this satisfies the law of Moses in God providing for the poor. You see what I'm talking about here? So he had to make sure they qualified. He had to make sure Ruth qualified. So therefore, he had a knowledge of Ruth, who she was related to, and where she came from. So therefore, okay, fine, Ruth, I understand you're a poor woman. You can now come and glean after the reapers. So he can give this information now to Boaz, and that's what he is doing. And so what he says, so she has come, she was related to Naomi. She is a Moabitess herself. That is, she is not an Israelite woman, but from the Moabite people. But nevertheless, she married into the family of Naomi. She's returned back to Naomi. And so she came and asked me, verse number 7, permission to glean in the field after the reapers. And I told her, fine. And she's been working all morning, but right now she's taking a rest break in the house where she's been sitting just for a little while. Verse number 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. And when you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. Now, isn't that nice? So what happens? So Boaz goes to meet Ruth. She's in the house on a break. And so he begins to talk to her and says to her, he implores her to stay with him. Don't go and glean in another field. So Boaz is clearly interested in Ruth. And may I dare say, as a man, his interest is not just simply trying to do good and be good to Ruth. He probably has a hope involved. And guys, you know what I mean by hope. But anyway, so he says, stay here. Stay in my field and stay with my maids. And what he means by his maids, these are the women who make up the gleaners, not the reapers now. The reapers are the ones who are in the employment of Boaz, but the gleaners are not. They just come and get a certain amount, okay? Just for their provision for the day. They constitute the poor people. So he's saying the group of women, stay with them. And I like that too, because what we're going to see about Boaz is his protective nature of Ruth by staying with the women, and also to some of the other things that he's going to say. But let's go on. Still in verse number 9. So he says, stay in my field, stay with the women gleaners who glean in my field. And let me tell you something too. I have commanded those men who work for me, the reapers, these are the servants, not to touch you. So that sense of not to touch you could imply to harass you. And let me just simply use it in a universal sense, because this is what Boaz is trying to say. Don't harass you in any way. Don't put your hands on her, whether in a sexual way. When women are poor and poor people take advantage of them, and they could sexually harass, abuse, and that's the idea. Don't bother her at all. Don't put your hands on her. And then he says at the end of verse number 9, let's see something very important. When you are thirsty, Boaz says to Ruth, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. Why is that so important? As one who gleans, and this is going to come up again, gleans in the field, not a servant working in the field. A servant working in the field was entitled to drink in the water jars. That was for the servants who work, not for the gleaners. They ain't working for Boaz. They're just gathering for themselves. But notice he gives Ruth the permission to drink from the provision of the servants themselves. So clearly he is taking somewhat of a vested interest in Ruth by allowing her. You don't have to worry about what you need to drink. You go and drink from the waters that I have provided for my servants. And thus, in this gesture, and all of the fullness of this gesture, we have the response of Ruth to Boaz taking notice of her. Verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Again, notice what we see implicitly in the personality, in the character of Ruth. She fell on her face to the ground. And we're going to see that too. And that's what I'm trying to say, ladies. Learn something about being respectable. True respect is not being nasty and sharp-mouthed, but having a sense of humility, and not so much as trying to see yourself as some second-class citizen. You think that's what God is trying to say about Ruth? Or do you think that is the case in the mind of God? God sees women as second-class citizens? No. They're equal to men, although they play different roles. These roles are given by God. But anyway, let's get back to Ruth, what we can see in her character. Notice the deep respect that she speaks to in how she speaks to Boaz. And she understands that she herself, humility, is deserving of nothing. She is not a Jewish woman. She is not entitled to these benefits that are given to poor Israelite women. Notice she says what? Since I am a foreigner. So there is a sense of humility that you see with Ruth. There's a sense of gratefulness that Boaz has taken notice of her, and even a sense of inquisitiveness with Ruth, wondering why is it that he's taking such interest in her. But anyway, ladies, you probably know one of the reasons what's going on in the back of her mind, that he probably kind of likes me. And we're going to see that develop even more so later on in the story. But so she inquires with great humility of his acknowledgement of her. Verse 11, Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. So Boaz, in his response to Ruth, when she was asking him, well, how did you even know me or know about me? And then Boaz lets us know that when the servant, when Boaz, remember when Boaz asked his servant about Ruth, clearly the servant gave him more information that was just simply written in the passage. The passage just only gave us the gist of it. But Boaz lets us know that it was a more fuller conversation that his manager had with him when the manager told him, Boaz, about Ruth. That's why he says it has been fully, verse number 11, reported to me. He told me completely. Ruth had to explain herself to the manager to qualify herself as a gleaner to be able to come into this field free of charge and follow after the reapers, having this benefit that was given for the Jewish women. Okay, but anyway, so he says, I know about it, and I know about your allegiance to Naomi, your mother-in-law, and the integrity that you have and how you have suffered so many things just to be loyal to your mother-in-law, and even, most importantly, leaving your own peoples, your father and your mother's house, leaving them, blood relatives, to come with an in-law. How amazing that is, how striking and remarkable that is, and even coming to a land not your own, to a people, Israel, not your own, to a God not your own. It has been fully reported, and I admire that. And that's the essence of what Boaz is saying to Ruth, how he is so impressed with her character, her dignity, her loyalty, her commitment. And may I even say, ladies, no doubt there probably was some visible thing about Ruth that was captivating. She was pretty, probably, I would say, probably, and this caught his eye. But notice what caught his mind. What caught his mind. It was not her appearance, because notice now, remember, she's poor. She has nothing. So she's not dressing. She ain't dressed up. Let me just say it like it is. She ain't dressed up. Her hair ain't done. Her nails ain't done, and all of that. She's working hard in a field. Now, what do you think she looks like? Working hard in a field, gathering after the reapers. What you think that looks like? So what is impressive to her, to Boaz, is not so much as her physical appearance, but her character, her integrity. Ladies, you see, implied even in that book. We're going to see. Ladies, you wait till we get to the next lesson. The next lesson, as we talk about this narrative in the book of Ruth, is going to be about how to catch a man. How to catch a man. What truly catches a man is more than just that outer envelope of the appearance. That waxes old, and it's nothing special about that. Pretty women are a dime a dozen. They're everywhere. Every time you turn on your TV, every time you turn on the magazine, every time you look at the Twitter, the Facebook, and what else mess they got out there. Something other. I can't remember that because I don't do all of that stuff. But it's everywhere. And that's all you see, women trying to sell themselves from the Kim Kardashian point of view, from the appearance of beauty. But what is truly important to a righteous man, to a man of integrity? Because remember, that's Boaz. What's truly important to a godly man, to a good man, is not so much as what you look like, but it is what kind of woman that you are. And notice what we see developing with Ruth: deep respect, humility, integrity, godliness. That's beautiful. Notice even the book of Proverbs talk about a woman's beauty. It says beauty is vain, but godliness, oh, how precious and valuable that is for a woman. But anyway, so let's go on. I know I'm a little long. Let me bring this to a close. So he wishes her nothing but good things in verse number 12 when he says Yahweh. In other words, since you have come to a God, our God, the Israelite God, may that God, Yahweh, bless you for what you have done, for the choices that you made, and stand with this old woman coming to our land, even though you could have stayed with your own people and your own God. May our God, the true God, truly bless you as you seek protection. I like that too. How evident that is in all of what Ruth is doing. And what we're going to see in the next section, but how you seek protection under the wings of God. May God bless you, daughter. And so 13, Ruth responds, and then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord. Oops, ladies. For you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant. Oops, ladies, though I am not like one of your maidservants. So she simply responds to his words of kindness to her and his wish for blessings from God to her. I'm so thankful that you saw me and that you recognized me. And notice she called him my Lord, a sense of deep respect. Again, ladies, I don't want you to miss that. I'm not trying to say, let me say that you going around bowing down to every man. That's not what I'm not trying to say. But what you can see is integral in the character and nature of this godly woman, Ruth, is respectfulness. Respectfulness that you saw from her mother-in-law, Naomi, asking her permission to go to work, and even respectfulness to Boaz, okay? So, my Lord, and she said, you spoke kindly to me, and notice how she addresses herself as his maidservant. Again, the sense of respectfulness. So she's basically saying, I appreciate everything that you said to me, and I appreciate you allowing me to come and glean after your servants in the field. All right, let's push forward a little time in this narration. Let's go on a little bit further chronologically. So at mealtime, what Boaz said to Ruth, come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. Oh, you need to see this. So what? Oh, Boaz is clearly interested in Ruth. So now we move to like midday. During the time, usually working hard. So clearly Ruth has been in the field working after the reapers all day. So she's been working there. She took a little break. Now the work has started back. Now after the work, we have what we kind of like call a lunch break, like midday break, because you're working long and this is the time to eat. So Ruth has been hanging in there with them all day long, and so now it's time to eat. And when the time comes for the meal time, we see Boaz is eating along with his servants. So there's something to be said about that, isn't it? Boaz eating with his servants, his humility, his compassionate nature. You can see all of that involved in it as he deals with his servant, but also too, the point, his interest in Ruth that he invites her. Remember, Ruth is not a servant. She is not one of the reapers. She is a part of the gleaners. And two, probably a lot of the gleaners had already dropped out, gotten whatever they thought that they needed for the day, and gone back home. But Ruth was still hanging in there, even during the lunchtime. You got it? And so Boaz invites her to the table to eat with him and his servants. That is what is unusual, because the gleaners would not eat with the servants. They would not. But Boaz gives her a place of honor. So he is honoring Ruth by saying, come sit with me. Come sit with me, as Boaz was sitting with his servants. And so he handed out to her. So, of course, whether he did it with his own hand or commanded it to be done, to give her some of the food. Now, notice here, I know I'm a little long on verse 14, but I want you to see it. So she is sitting there beside the reapers. And I can imagine the reapers going like, she up in here with us, so to speak. But she's sitting there, and now he's give her something to eat. Serves her some roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied, but here's the good part. She had some left. Generosity. We see what? Generosity of Boaz. But we can also see in the generosity of Boaz, speaking of his character in general, but also highlighting the interest that he had in Ruth. You see, he didn't give her at that time of eating just enough to eat right then. He gave her more than enough. You know, it's kind of like the wink, wink, so to speak. But anyway, let's go on. We got to bring it to a close. When she arose, verse 15. She arose to glean. Oh, I like that. Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. What? Do not insult her. I like that. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. What? What's going on? So lunchtime is over with. And so she arose to glean. Ruth went back to work. So what we'll begin to develop to see, Ruth was a hard worker. Okay, do you see all of the different character traits that the Bible is talking about Ruth? Her respectfulness, her humility. She is a hard worker. All of these wonderful things, right? Ladies went back into the field to glean. We also see some things, sticking with verse 15, about Boaz indicating his interests in Ruth. He liked her. What? He commanded his servants. This is unusual. The servants were the guys who were reaping, working in the field. Let her glean even among the sheaves. You need to understand what he's saying. Remember, first would come the reapers. These guys are the servants that Boaz's field. The reapers would go out into the field and they would begin to do the harvesting first. And they would get the majority of the stuff. And they would leave a little bit on the vine or on the sheaf or whatever. Leave a little bit for the gleaners to come. So the gleaners would come and take of the little bit that's left on the crop itself for the gleaner. And Ruth was the gleaner, okay? But notice what he says. Let her glean even among the sheaves. So in other words, as the reapers are going out to begin to harvest the crops, he's saying, let Ruth hang with you. In other words, don't let her follow after you and pick up the leftovers. No, let her choose from the crop itself while you are getting the best of the harvest. Let her gather of the best along with you. Let her glean among the sheep and do not insult her. I like that too. Where it says, here is where the Hebrew comes into play for you guys. It's been a couple of points where the Hebrew is significant, but let me bring this too. The negative particle that is used for not in Hebrew is lo. Now, let me say this. I know it's a little long, but listen. There are, in general, two negative particles, al and lo. Both of them are translated no, N-O, or not. It's negative, all right? However, the distinction is when you use al as a negative particle, the idea usually means temporary. It means that whatever the no is not a no for all time. It's not like a permanent no. But when you use lo, it means like it carries the sense of permanency. It carries the sense of permanently. Let it always be this way. And so the point here is, in the Hebrew, he chose the term lo as the negative particle. So what he is saying is, when it comes time, remember, he had already told Ruth, don't leave my field. Whenever you come to glean, glean with my ladies, right? So he's saying for her, not just glean today, but come back and glean tomorrow. And whenever you glean, keep coming back, Ruth, and stay with my folk. Now he's directing a command to those he worked for, and he says, what to them? Do not insult her. That is, do not shame her. Do not, the sense of upbraid, that's the word that's coming to my mind, in the sense of fuss at her. It's like, what, in other words, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be following after us and gathering what's left. You don't supposed to be with us gathering what's already here. Get back behind us and get in your place. That's what Boaz is saying to his servants. Don't say a word to her. But the point that I was talking about, the low, let me finish that. I'm sorry, guys, I skipped a little bit. But by using that negative particle, he is saying, and whenever Ruth begins to come to glean, let her always come with you guys. She does not have to be with the gleaners. I am giving her permission to follow with you guys and take from the best of what I got. Is he interested in Ruth or not? But anyway, he even goes on to say, verse number 16, notice, and you will also purposely pull out for her some of the grain from the bundles and leave it. In other words, you in your gathering, gather some. You see, kind of like, imagine Ruth is falling on the side of you. You see Ruth falling on the side of you. Cut some down for her. Not only just for your job, gathering it for me, but also too, I want you to work for her and cut some down for her. Again, is he interested or not? And then he says again, and do not rebuke her. Whatever you do, say nothing to her. Okay, let's close the video with verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. I like that. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay, it may seem simple, but what is it saying? So many wonderful things about Ruth. Notice she started out early in the morning, and ladies, how long did she work? She worked all day long. She worked for herself. She worked for her mother-in-law from the morning until evening. And then what? She beat out when it comes. Remember, this is from the wheat, the barley harvest, right? Wheat harvest. And you have to beat it out. And once you finish beating it out, then you get the kernels of wheat, right? And all of this goes into like a bushel. So once it was all done, when she got through with everything that she had done and beaten it out, notice she had about an ephah. An ephah is roughly about 22 to 35 liters. I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, it was a significant amount of wheat that she actually beat out. So what is important about this? What am I trying to say? Not only did she work all day, but by the amount, the average amount would not be this much. The average amount would not be this much, especially for a woman. So Ruth worked long and Ruth worked hard. She was a hard worker, and she was a woman of great humility, respect, and integrity. And thus we are painting such a wonderful, almost just about full portrait of Ruth. All right. Thanks so much, guys, for joining me with that. So let's recap So what do we have? Now it comes to a point they are now in the land and they understand that they need to provide for themselves. Ruth understands this. And so she says to her mother-in-law, she requests permission to go work. So beautiful that we see developing in her personality, her characteristics. She asks permission from her old mother-in-law to go to work. Her mother-in-law says yes, and we see that providence is already beginning to shake place, as she says, in whose field that I might find favor. And it opened up the very passage talking about Boaz, a mighty man of wealth, who was actually kin to Naomi's husband, Elimelech, and thus he is kin to Ruth's dead husband. But nevertheless, she goes out and she gets permission from the manager to work in the field. And then Boaz is introduced as coming from the city. He wants to come and check on his workers, and he is with his workers. We see that he is introduced respectful, humble, as a righteous man and a compassionate man. And he takes notice of Ruth the Moabitess. So he inquires of his manager, the manager of his field workers, about Ruth. And so he tells her, because remember, Ruth as a gleaner had to get permission of the manager to glean after the reapers. And so she needed to tell him about herself and her plight so that she would qualify as a poor person in order for to be able to glean after the reapers. And so Boaz finds out about Ruth, and so he meets her and he blesses Ruth as she is taking a short break in the house. He blesses her for what she has done. She left her father's house and things of that nature and has come to a land not hers and to a God not hers. And so he blesses her and tells her to stay with him and stay with his maid servants in the field. And so it continues on until they got into time for lunch break. And he honors Ruth and says, come and eat with me and my servants. And he serves Ruth and he gives her more than enough to eat. And after the meal time is over with, Ruth goes back out into the field to work. And Boaz commands his servants. He said, look, don't you bother her. Don't you say nothing to her. And I want you to let her glean with you. So not after you, but with you. And also, too, you cut some of this stuff down and you give it to her. And we see that in all of these things, we see how Boaz is showing a great interest, wink, wink, if you know what I mean, in Ruth the Moabitess. And so Ruth continues on and to glean. And so she finds herself not only just gleaning with the gleaners, but she is now gleaning with the reaper. So she is able to get a whole lot. And so she works all day long. So by the evening time, when she threshes out what she has gathered, that woman has gathered an ephah, quite abnormal, a large amount, especially for a woman in that particular time. So almost like completing that portrait that we have, the integrity of Ruth, the humility of Ruth, the respectfulness of Ruth, how she is a hard worker. And she gathers so much at the end of the day. And we leave with the interest of Boaz in Ruth. So join me next time as we continue in our study of Ruth, where we're going to see how Ruth goes home to bless Naomi with her production of the day and tell her about the events of the day. And Naomi, as a wise woman, notice I said that, ladies, a wise woman is smart, and she recognizes and understands that Boaz is interested in Ruth.